Hi, welcome everybody. Wonderful to be on this morning, just chatting to you about one of our sort of most important processes, burying the dead cats. Lovely to see everybody online. So before we get going, just a reminder, our past leadership webinars in this sort of strategy cafe title are all available on the YouTube channel. I think there's 62 fabulous interviews with leaders and discussions on a huge range of leadership topics. Including last month's interview between Minter, Dial, Michael Borelli, and Wanda about AI risks and regulations. So I highly recommend you go have a look at that, have a bit of a dive in, loads of fabulous ideas in there. So today, though, is a bit of a change of tack, as you can see from that agenda, and we're back to the human dynamic, particularly how working on how we resolve tensions and conflicts opens up a pathway to all of that important chemistry essential to high performance in our teams, efficiency, and kind of getting into this idea of team flow, whether that's your family, within the family business environment, or your colleagues. And we're going to be discussing the power of burying the dead cats. So before we get into that, let's just start with introductions. So welcome to the team.
Morning, everyone. Shall I kick us off? Noticing I might look a little different from that picture. That might need the updated website version. I'm Matt. I'm one of the senior strategy facilitators at Alembic. My background is in private healthcare, but I work with businesses across all sectors today, working with leaders to help solve some of their most complex problems.
Yeah, I'll go next just because I'm next in the picture. Hello, everyone, and lovely to be here. I'm also a senior strategy facilitator at Alembic and a coach, and my background is management consulting and transformation. And this topic about conflict and tension is particularly relevant because when change happens, and especially transition into from A to B, can bring a lot of tension. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Barbara. My name is Wanda. I'm also a strategy advisor and a senior coach. My background is in organizational psychology. I've worked with teams all over the globe. And one of my favorite things to work with and work through is conflict. So it's a beautiful, rich, wonderful topic today, and I hope you all leave with something valuable.
Wonderful, thanks team. So let's get going. So here is Daisy the dead cat, and you can see a little bit of a note there about her. So a dead cat, what is a dead cat? You probably heard it talked about in UK politics. For us, a dead cat is what we use as a metaphor for the uncomfortable issues that prevent us from being in connection. And we really like it because it's such a visceral image and more powerful as a metaphor than this idea of the elephant in the room. You can't ignore it. You have to get your hands dirty here and deal with the smelly dead cats. Our process is really carefully designed to help team members solve their problems themselves. So we'll come on to more of that later. But for the moment, just think about using this process to bring a team back together after a period of hard work where tensions will have just naturally elevated because of the time we have to properly talk through things. And also to save relationships that are really close to breaking point. So those are kind of the main user cases clients have for our process of burying the dead cats. I just want to say it's not a mediation. This is a really beautiful, carefully constructed coaching and facilitating process. And with that, I'm going to throw the ball to Matt and let Matt take us forward.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, Dead Cats is we think, a really amazing approach for resolving conflict, but definitely not the norm in businesses. Nick mentioned mediation there, which people might be more familiar with, which can be a reasonable option to turn to. You can get good value from it. And it's great that some companies do have mediation type processes. but they can be very variable, both in success rate and what people actually do and what they use them for. And sometimes, as Nick says, it's not addressing the kind of underlying issues. And it's this variability in approach that I think is a good place to get started today. So to get us kicked off, I thought we would do a poll and have a look at how everybody in the audience and their business deals with conflict. And in fact, if they do deal with conflict at all. Excellent. So you should see up there, what is your organization's process for dealing with conflict? And that is, we don't have a process. We go to HR. We have some kind of process around mediation. We have board or director intervention, or you don't know. So a lot of people have never run into this. Okay, so the two most common responses there are we don't have a process, or board or director intervention. Interesting. We suspected the first one might come up highly, and it's interesting we've got board and director intervention in there as well. And we'll come back to that in the next section. Thank you for the votes. Next slide. Thank you. So I suppose a good place to continue on this line of thinking is, why is it important to deal with conflict in organizations, and what can be the potential implications of doing nothing, or just dealing with it very badly, or with no process. And when I was thinking through this, the first three things that came to my mind were probably number one, time. It can be very time consuming. Number two was probably around cost, and maybe number three around team performance. So they were the three things that came to my mind anyway, and I'm sure there'll be other things which come to other people's minds depending on how much you've done this and what specifically you've had to deal with around conflict. And in fact, these three things kind of tie together in reality. Time is money, poor performance has cost implications, etc. I'm sure many of you have been in a position to see firsthand how conflict and some of these things can affect teams and businesses as a whole, and how really disruptive it can be. I think one of the reasons it can be so damaging to teams, the way that they work in general, is that it creates an environment where people can naturally shy away. You might have a few confrontations around specific issues, or a project or a disagreement, but in the long run, people tend to avoid others where it's likely they're going to end up in confrontation. After all, it can be very tiring and disruptive, and the body tends to condition us to avoid things which are really highly draining. So we'll stay away from situations like that. This kind of avoidance can lead to some of the more noticeable things, things like poor communication in teams, which can lead to inefficiencies, people just not following the processes which have been agreed and doing their own thing. You can have things like infighting, siloed working. You can end up with really poor morale in your team and reduced staff satisfaction. And actually, you can end up with poor reported mental health, or even increased staff turnover. And I'm sure everybody knows what pay in recruitment is. So it can have serious implications, and it really depends on what that situation looks like. When we consider conflict at a leadership or board level, the effect can be even more impactful. It's probably worth noting just at this point, while we're looking at unresolved conflict, which is causing issues in businesses, there's also a healthy level of conflict, which can be useful to work through. And in a board setting, that is particularly noteworthy, as directors are trying to solve some of the more difficult and high stakes problems in the business, and a bit of tension and conflict is definitely healthy and really normal in that situation. It's when you end up with long-standing conflict and damaged relationships around an area, particularly where it's seemingly unable to be resolved, that you can end up with some proper issues arising. Some of the issues here and implications around leadership conflict can be things like disjointed or poor messaging coming from the leadership, apparent lack of direction with no clear joined up vision, or something like inertia in decision making and things like that. And ultimately, it can have an impact on the company culture and factor into a whole host of other problems. I think often people really underestimate how much it can be felt throughout the business, and consistency in leadership is particularly important. It can be really difficult when you don't have good alignment with the leadership team. And there's also definitely something we talked about at Alembic when we were talking about this. There's often an element of normalcy bias with things like this, where people just get used to the way it is, and it just feels normal, kind of business as usual. And while this can be good for making people feel less stressed out, for all the reasons above, it's not great. Next slide, please. So when we think about conflict resolution in business, one of the first things which often comes to mind as a solution is HR. Now, HR has its strengths and its weaknesses. It can be really great for some things. It can make people feel really supported. It gives everybody a fair voice, and the clear process can help people in what can be quite difficult or ambiguous times. However, there are also areas where the standard HR process doesn't really fit well, or the department could maybe not be empowered to address the real issues, or the structure could feel too controlling and leave people feeling pushed or isolated. Now, again, I am generalizing a little bit with HR, because I acknowledge that there are some fantastic HR departments out there with really, really good capabilities, and might be really empowered. But I think mostly the focus with HR is on resolving specifics, like the thing which has caused the problem. And this approach, when done well under the right circumstances, can be good. But often you see the same people coming back with similar problems further down the line. And as we alluded to a little bit at the start, it can be because this process is aimed at resolving something specific, like a specific conflict, and not the underlying relational problems which are perhaps causing these things to happen in the first place. So it can fall short of resolving the conflict in a more permanent way. As I mentioned, mediation is something which can fit into this box as well. There's also a point for many businesses, I think particularly smaller ones, where HR can be a little bit of an afterthought, and maybe there's not a good process in place for resolving conflict. It might be more structured around things like standard performance improvement plans, problems with conduct, hiring, firing, avoiding legal issues, and that kind of thing. Next slide, please. And when you look at the board and how conflict is managed in that space, you find even more variability than we've talked about already. If you think about it, it is a little puzzling. The most high-stakes environment in your business tends to be the one where it is most common to have no process at all around conflict. We talked about this a bit at Alembic when we were doing our discussion before this webinar, about how it is quite normal with a board and conflict to do nothing. I think one of the major contributing factors for me is it is really, really difficult. There are no standard processes. Getting it wrong can have really high consequences. And HR generally are just not empowered at this level to intervene. Really, really rarely in small companies. And the only real structure I could think about when we were talking this through was kind of clauses in shareholder agreements around mediation, where you can't come to an agreement. But I think when we talked about it, we couldn't really think of good examples of where this was used well before kind of lawyers had become involved and the process had really fallen apart. At this point, I'm interested to pose the question to my colleagues. Where have you seen these kind of HR processes really struggle? And I think Nick, you had a good example when we talked through it.
Yeah, if it's okay to come in. I mean, this is like the classic space for burying the dead cats, because as you say, Matt, you might have an HR director, but the HR director is the director amongst equals at this level, and in a way, even though that's kind of true legally, probably the lesser of equals, right? Because there's a chief executive there, or a managing director and a chair, and just from a kind of status point of view, they've got kind of more seniority around the board table. And so it's incredibly tough for the HR director to manage conflict laterally and upwards. That's not really a thing. So, you know, either you kind of go into a bit of isolation and the HR director is maybe supporting the chair or supporting the chief executive, right? And trying to help with that. It's a real struggle for them. And then you've got to ask the question, you know, it's a relationship set around the board table. So inevitably here, the chief executive and the chair are involved. They might not think they are. They might want to be kind of polarized and, you know, blaming other board members, but really everyone is involved. So there's no way out of that loop, really. And at this level, unless you're going to descend into legals, in which case you go to your shareholders agreement, or maybe you've got a great chair, and sometimes people have really good chairs who are very neutral and not political and will step in at this point and try and resolve things. Even if it's with the chief executive, they can kind of have a word with the chief executive, and that's kind of part of the chair's role. Otherwise, you need someone outside the system, and this is a great user case for a facilitation, right, to try and resolve this. Who else wants to come in? Barbara, I see you want to come in.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is power play here, so and the board, but also personalities and inflexibility in a way, and lack of a process, a structured process. And these are some of the causes that we observe a lot in businesses. And I would like to take this as an opportunity to talk more about what are the causes that cause that cuts in businesses and an organization. So if we go to the next slides, we have clubbed a number of factors. So environmental factors play an important role when in tensions and conflict, particularly communication, lack of or pure communication. So poor communication within the organization can lead to misunderstandings, misinterpretation, and ultimately conflict. Equally, something that we don't necessarily, companies do not necessarily pay attention to, is the misuse of channels of communication. That can create loads of misunderstanding and tensions. Badly delivered feedback and tendency to unstructured feedback can also create resentment that can then cause friction and tension rather than growth and improvement. Ambiguity within an organization, which translates into unclear goals, and this could be widespread, or it can be coming from the board or from just supervisors and just specific teams. So unclear goals, unclear expectations, vague projects with not necessarily good KPIs, so key performance indicator, are good ground for breeding conflict. And that's because individuals and teams are unclear about what's expected of them. Equally, in terms of environment, we have unclarity about structures and roles, because not clearly defined structures and accountabilities again translates into individuals not knowing what's expected on them, and just stepping on each other's toes, which is about specifically about responsibilities and decision making. Who has got the authority to make decisions? Last but not least, highly competitive cultures can lead to conflict because individuals or teams tend to want to prove themselves right rather than turning to colleagues as collaborators. Then too much competition turns colleagues into enemies or rivals. And normalcy bias is something that Nick already mentioned. So leaders exhibiting behaviors that normalize conflict rather than addressing them, then can trickle the whole organization down into just thinking that that's normal. Now, some personal factors have already been mentioned, and within the personal factors, what we tend to observe is literally personalization. So people taking things personally, even if they're not intending to. But this means that minor things can escalate into significant disputes among specific people. And conflicting values and principle, and I think Steve in the chat you have put that, yes, we see that a lot. I mean, conflicting values and principles can lead to friction and conflict. At personal level, which can also reflect at organizational level, a lack of emotional intelligence, so lack of effective communication, active listening, empathy. So really essential skills to resolve conflict. The lack of that can then foster conflict and tension. And sometimes is also forcing the resolution of a tension and a conflict from the organization. Can also, at a personal level, create resistance, because if the organization and the processes within the organization do not solve the root cause of the problem, then people feel that they are forced into something that is effectively not helping them, and therefore resistance can happen. Now, few more in terms of high affect context, and what we mean by that is emotionally charged situations. So when emotions runs high, so for example, there are times in the year end, for example, can be one time when emotion runs high, especially if business performance is not hitting targets. That can create heightened emotion and stress, which can lead to tensions and conflict. And also we have spoken about low morale, sometimes when there's loads of change or loads of transformation that again might not necessarily cater for people's emotions, and people might be scared, fearful, dissatisfied, and therefore all of that can create an environment where disputes are likely to emerge. We have already talked about relational skills and emotional skills in general. Particularly important to mention here is that if leaders, if supervisors have not got the skills, then the conflict might be, the role modeling of how to deal with situations when conflict arise might not be role model, and that can create even major effect in the organization. Now, these are some of the causes, and there are many more, and as we're going to speak through, a few more will arise, but we club those into this main factor. And then what we wanted to share with you is the symptoms. So what are the things that you should be really looking out for when there is underlying conflict, and how can you overall recognize this? So silos is it's a symptoms that shows up when there is conflict and tension, and it's silos department that can often fail, so can often descend into sites. Division, so division in terms of people not cooperating, team not cooperating, and this can show up in many different ways. So it can show up just in communication and lack of communication, or in disruptive communication, but also in systems not being updated. You will also see a lot of what we call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which is basically disruptive behavior. So you can see criticism, you can see contempt, so disrespect happening, stonewalling, so disengagement, and equally defensiveness. And this can show up in many different ways. And last but not least, is ambiguity. So as we said, contradictory messages, contradictory goals, and unclear guidance. So these are some of the main symptoms. So these are things that you can see. And now I will put back into the team the question about, why do you think this is important to, so why is it important to manage this situation in the right way, but especially at the right time? And whoever wants to pick that.
I'll pick that up, Barbara, because I think it leads beautifully into what I'm going to just mention, which is really around focusing on why you might want to resolve these and why it's really critical. And I think for me, one of the biggest factors goes back to what you were saying previously about resentments and disappointments and disillusionment and personalization that often sits beneath the surface and therefore comes up again and again and again. And this is why we see kind of repetitive cycles of conflict a lot of the time if it's not resolved well. Nick, can you maybe put on my slide? Thank you. That's great. So where I wanted to pick up with that was just to say that, you know, it's a little bit all of those factors that are potentially not resolved when we think that we've moved past the conflict or past the tension. A lot of these underlying factors still remain. And it's a little bit like a bump under the carpet, really. You know, we sweep them under there and we can't really see them every day. But over time, that bump gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually the bump is so big that it trips us up. You know, we're trying to get from A to B as a team, or try to get from A to B as an organization. And there's all this stuff that's in the way under the carpet. So the knock-on effects of actually not resolving conflict well, or just ignoring those elements of kind of resentment or disappointment or personalization, just trying to ignore those and pretend that we're moving on, you know, can have huge implications down the line. Everybody's conflict tolerance levels are very, very different. Everybody views conflict in very different way because it's very personal. And people do tend to personalize issues when they come up. So all of our lenses through which we engage with the world, like all of the things that we've experienced, how we've seen conflict resolved in the past, whether we view conflict as something to be avoided or something to be worked through, these all will impact our ability to really have a tolerance for conflict and be able to resolve things in a healthy way. Next slide. Thank you, Nick. So what does it really feel like then when we're experiencing conflict? Well, conflict is a little bit like bumping up against each other. Imagine that all of the lenses that we see the world through and all the lenses that we view things on is like a VR headset. And our view and our perceptions of what's going on is this VR headset that we wear all the time. Now, if I'm wearing a VR headset and I'm in one reality, and Matt's wearing a VR headset and he's in another reality, and Barbara's wearing a VR headset and she's in a third reality, if we're all wandering around in these different realities, it stands to reason that we're going to bump up against each other. And so conflict is often a bumping up. It's a bumping up where we just not seeing things in the same way. We're not experiencing things in the same way. We can't step into one another's realities of what's happening. And so therefore we bump up against each other. It's completely normal. For me, there's kind of two polarities around conflict. The one is tension and the other is friction. Tension can actually be a really healthy form of conflict. It helps keep things in balance. It helps open up different perspectives, give one another different lines of sight of information that we might need to move forward. And then there's friction. And friction is really where that bumping up moves from a mild kind of nudge up against one another to this kind of wild hurtling where we're actually like banging up, and it can be really painful. So sometimes it's easier to navigate if there's someone else in the room helping us to really move forward, to really help us to move towards something and to move toward one another as opposed to away from one another. It's like having a little bit of a guiding hand sometimes that can actually help us to direct towards one another instead of us wandering around in our VR headsets quite blindly. So why does it feel so awkward or uncomfortable or painful? So it feels that way because you want something and I want something different. So there's already that tension. And sometimes it feels so uncomfortable because we just don't have a really well-aligned, well-developed capacity for holding that discomfort. So developing the capacity to hold that discomfort is really an important part of this beautiful Bury the Dead Cats process that we have. And often when we're trying to get our point across, or we imagine that the person's VR headset is really fixed on and they're going in their own direction and not even worrying about our direction, we just tend to restate our positions more and more and harder and harder. And that actually drives us further apart. We then experience this kind of ballooned discomfort, polarized states where we're both sitting on opposite ends. I have my view, you have your view. There's a lot of discomfort, and it's really become a hugely inflated situation and develops a life of its own. As Barbara spoke about personal aspects, people really don't understand one another or communicate effectively with one another through that bumping up, through that balloon discomfort. And so therefore, it just perpetuates the discomfort, and the painful situations just perpetuate. Move on to the next slide, please, Nick. So really, why does it happen? Well, our permanently predicting brains are really designed to protect us. They're simply doing their job. And when we feel discomfort, our brains perceive a threat, and therefore we react toward that threat, designed to really protect us. So embracing tension is stepping out of our comfort zone into complexity and being able to hold that space where we feel the discomfort, but we're able to be in that discomfort at the same time. So it's a really delicate balance to be able to do that without it tipping into chaos. But it looks a little bit like this, right? It looks like the fact that that discomfort or that distortion is really big in the beginning, and our comfort zone is really tiny, and our growth zone sits somewhere in between. But the more that we can develop that capacity to be in the discomfort and move through it and express ourselves in healthy ways, and to move from the unhealthy conflict to the healthy tension, potentially, as a way of resolving all the stuff that's under the carpet, our zone begins to grow. Our capacity for being in the discomfort begins to grow. Next slide, please, Nick. And so really learning to embrace the tension like this, high wire artist here is really the key, right? Learning to really embrace that tension, to recognize it when it comes up for us, and then learning the skills that are associated with holding a lot of different perspectives at one time. So I might see truth in the 1D, Matt might see truth in the 2D, and Nick might see truth in the 3D, when actually they're all the same thing. So being able to hold these multiple perspectives are really some of the skills that we encounter and that people learn through this Bury the Dead Cats process. So why do these capacities really matter when conflict happens? Well, it really matters that we develop these capacities to be in discomfort, because conflict is going to happen. We're never going to agree with everybody. It's a normal part of life that we're going to experience tensions and frictions and conflict. And we're living in increasingly complex and uncertain times. And because we're living in increasingly complex and uncertain times, we're going to find that people are going to think very, very, very differently and feel very, very differently about all of that complexity and uncertainty. So I'm going to hand to Nick, who's going to maybe tell us a little bit about how to kind of address the way through this before it gets a life of its own and really grows, catches momentum and catches fire, because so often conflict situations do.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Wanda. I think this really beautiful way to sort of wrap up the context of conflict. And I kind of want to make a link here. So Steve has put a lovely comment up about expectations. And so I think everyone can kind of tune into that. That if I expect conflict, then my discomfort is going to rise. And if I expect conflict to be unresolvable, then that's how I'm going to be coming into it. And if I expect conflict to be unresolvable and really horrible, then my tension, my defensiveness is going to be really primed, or my fight-flight response is going to be very close before I even start sort of talking about it. And so this idea that our expectations are deeply involved in how we come towards conflict is really important. And actually, it's much more subtle than just like the cognitive idea of what am I expecting? Like, am I expecting an appointment at 9 o'clock is like one really simple way of saying expectations. There's a really deeper way of understanding expectations, which it is literally everything that I am doing is an expectation. Like how the next moment is going to unfold for me is a deeply felt expectancy, right? So it's a whole mind-body experience, this idea of expectations. And so if you want to change your experience of conflict, what you've got to do is you've got to change how your group expects conflict to work out, which is why it's hard, because that's deeply habitual. And causes so many mistakes. So when we're talking about differences in beliefs, I just put a note up on the chat about this. Most commonly we find that's just a different way of interpreting the same thing. It's a mistake. It's normally a mistake when I think you don't believe things the way I do. It's part of this sort of distorted reality that happens. You know, and it can gain an energy of its own. So this idea of momentum. If our expectation is that conflict is going to balloon, then that rapidly gains energy and momentum, which is pulling us apart. And the process of burying the dead cats really slows things down, makes people properly pay attention, allows people to be deeply heard, and unpins some of these expected outcomes with surprise, which is, okay, that wasn't what I was expecting. You know, when we actually slow down, that wasn't what I was expecting. So from a moment of discomfort, heightened discomfort, to a moment of surprise where it's not like that. And that's that wonderful moment where your expectation about this conversation changes and you think, okay, maybe this is going to be okay. All right. So burying the dead cats just give you that moment to pause and reconnect, to ask that really hard question. Do you believe something different from me? Can we resolve that? Can I apologize for my misunderstanding? Can I forgive you? Can you forgive me? Can I let go of that? What do we do about that then? You know, how do we problem solve that? So it's this process of letting the emotions be expressed in a safer, constructive way, and that helps knit a deeper interpersonal connection. Right? It helps people gain this deeper level of insight about themselves, about each other, about the competencies that we can bring, how we can support this kind of process of knitting the discomfort back into a direction together. And so in a way, the possibility here is to go beyond just solving the immediate row and getting into what we would describe as real mastery as a member of the leadership team or as a leader, you know, and how you understand bringing people together and getting teams moving forwards together rather than just friction and moving apart. So that kind of idea. There's really important background framing for this. So just to kind of look through it for you, it's really important that everyone chooses. It shouldn't be a forced process. You need to choose to participate. It needs to be safe, right? So there needs to be agreement that the only action that's going to happen during Burying the Dead Cats is talking, and talking in confidence. It needs to be neutral. There needs to be neutrality. So you need that idea of a facilitator there who's not involved, who's neutral, who's there for the conversation, not for anyone. There needs to be acceptance. So everyone needs to be ready to accept and listen to every voice and treat every voice that's going to be spoken as having a valid thing to say, even if it's, you know, revved up by emotion. There's something there that needs to be heard. It needs accountability. So there needs to be a willingness just to ask people the hard question. Did you really not know that that was going to be the outcome of that? You know, can you just answer to that point, please? People need preparation for this, just to manage that expectancy and to get them kind of game ready for what might happen in a more emotional space. There needs to be a sense of commitment to stay with this conversation until it's done. And that's required kind of at the outset. There needs to be an openness, right? So this is a space where we talk through all possible options. Like we talk through all possible options, which is way better than fighting about those options if you can't resolve. And then fundamentally, it needs to be surrounded by expertise, you know, someone there who can read patterns of emotional communication and understand what might be going on for people as their body language is expressed in so many beautiful ways. Yeah. So I just say that maybe most clients just want to bury the dead cats and remove that deep discomfort. Right? It's not nice to be in a position where you're feeling really uncomfortable. You know, leadership teams are desperate to get back to getting on with things, and they don't want the time to be spent on this, right? So getting rid of the dead cats is just an amazing relief for people. And although the first kind of round of this can feel like quite scary for everyone, as soon as people have experienced it, they kind of want to do it, because the gain of doing burying the dead cats is so huge in terms of time efficiency and relationship that we have clients just saying, can we do a bury the dead cat session, please? Which might surprise you. So most clients take enough from the sessions to be able to resolve the future challenges themselves, which is really brilliant. But the tools and the skill sets and the capabilities that are inherent in this kind of process are really powerful. And so for some people, this is a wonderful opportunity for them to really think about developing their mastery as a leader, their family business capability, their leadership team capability, and some clients really latch onto that idea and take the opportunity of self-development as far as they can. Okay, so we've got some wonderful questions, and I'm hoping that everyone can stay on for a few minutes while we unpack those. If it's okay with you all, I'm just going to run through what's coming next, and then I'm going to close the session for everybody, this discussion about dead cats, turn the mics off, invite everyone who's still here to just join in and ask their questions to us collectively, and we can have maybe just 10 minutes of discussion around this kind of to wrap up together off the mic. So thank you very much for coming, everybody. It's been wonderful to talk to you about burying the dead cats. Next time in the new year, on the 25th of January, we're going to be having a leadership interview with this wonderful guy, John Hart. So John Hart runs a business around integrity around the way that boards work. And so this is about being investor ready, and what are the processes of behavior and ethics at board level you'd expect to see to generate that confidence in your decision-making process and your leadership. So whether you're a founder or a family business, this is going to be a great session for you to just come in and tune in on and just have a think about what you could do to improve your board's ethics and integrity. Right. So thank you very much for coming today.